Airing first on Asheville FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting out of occupied Cherokee land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world. This week, Bursts had the chance to interview Matt Meyer, who, among many other pursuits, is a retired professor and editor of A Soldier's Story, Revolutionary Writings by a New Afrikan Anarchist, out from PM Press, which highlights the life and writings of Kwasi Balagoon. Balagoon was a defendant in the Panther 21 case in the late 1960s, in which 21 people were arrested and accused of planned coordinated bombing and long-range rifle attacks on 2 police stations and an education office in New York City. He was ultimately acquitted of this, but was caught up on charges related to a robbery sometime later and passed in prison in 1986. In this interview, Bursts and Matt discuss Balagoon's life and writings, why this book is especially relevant now, and especially his abiding love for his comrades, a thing which seems to have driven much of his politics, and his queerness, and how complex it was. Stay tuned to the end of the conversation for questions submitted to The Final Straw by imprisoned anarchist Michael Kimble, who has been a guest on this show and is an admirer of Kuwasi. To see more of Michael's work and to write to him, you can visit anarchylive.noblogs.org. If you're listening to the radio version and want more audio content from Matt and Bursts, plus some announcements, check out the podcast version on our website, thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. Visit our show notes for links to the book and to more about our guest, Matt Meyer. Finally, thank you to everyone who replied in response to our 9th anniversary podcast special, in which me and Bursts interviewed each other about why we do what we do, some personal backstory for each of us, and opinions on media in general. We also used the opportunity to solicit listeners for another co-host, to share the workload and extend the option in case there was anyone out there who was interested. We got way more responses than we ever thought we would, and are working through to answer them in as complete and responsible a way as possible. If your interest is piqued and you want to hear this episode, it's up on our website along with all of the other archived material. Thanks again for all of your interest and your sweet words. And now some words from another imprisoned anarchist, Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We're caught like a boss!
As the conventional wisdom goes, you are what you eat. For some of us, that's more disturbing than for others. If we take that adage literally, you are what you eat. Some of us are pizzas and puddles of beer attached to brains pickled in bone water. Others of us are far more toxic. I turned 50 in September. I can tell you, if I knew I was really going to live this long, I would have eaten more yogurt and granola. Stuff we buy off the prison commissary is atrociously unhealthy. When I was in Toledo, Adam Baum and I would eat a meal we called Triglyceride Thursday. We called it that because, first, it elevated our triglycerides, whatever those are, and second, because we fixed the meal every Thursday for elimination night on The Biggest Loser. We'd eat obscene piles of unhealthy food and then watch fat people on TV work out, sweat, and cry. Fun times. Triglyceride Thursday had copious amounts of squeezed cheese, which is like eating tub and tile caulking, with a bit of red dye number 5 in it, and barbecue corn chips, summer sausage, and of course ramen noodles that we had fried in the microwave, which is really just burning the noodles and creating a highly carcinogenic compound called acrylamide. When we ate that, if we listened carefully, we could actually hear our own arteries hardening. Don't try this at home. No, really, don't do it. Ramen noodles have a flavor packet, and the number 1 ingredient is usually monosodium glutamate, MSG. Do you know what that is? Monosodium glutamate was first used as an expectorant in mustard gas in the First World War. It really has no flavor at all. It's a nerve agent. It's designed to excite the nerves in your mouth so that what little flavor is in the packet tastes like big flavor. If you eat that, you are deliberately introducing a nerve agent into your diet. You are what you eat. Congratulations, ramen noodle consumers. You are a component of mustard gas. Another common ingredient in our food is high fructose corn syrup. Corporate food producers put this in everything because it's cheaper than sugar. Know how it's made? Well, they take corn unfit even for cattle consumption, and they stick it in a giant steel vat in the ground. They put a lid on it and let it cook and rot for days or even weeks. Then, when they return and find a foam of rot on the top of the moldering pile of corn garbage, they skim that off. That is your high fructose corn syrup. It's in everything from soft drinks to candy. Another sweetener in soft drinks is something called glycol. Don't take my word for this. Check out the ingredients on your soft drinks, and then the ingredients on your antifreeze. You tell me what you're drinking. You are what you eat. Mustard gas and corn rot and antifreeze. Much of the fruits and vegetables produced in the U.S. can't be sold in Europe anymore because corporate producers in the U.S. engage in widespread genetic manipulation. For instance, corn has salmon genes spliced into it. Have you noticed that the apple-flavored Jolly Rancher candies don't really taste like apples? But often lately, your apples taste a lot more like the Jolly Rancher candies. Yeah, better living through microbiology. No one's quite sure the long-term impact of consuming these frankenfoods. We're like lab rats in a vast experiment. You are what you eat. That makes you a mustard gas corn rot genetic monster created by scientists working for corporate America. Yay. Now, let's get to the meat. Have you seen the feedlots for cows? We're talking about thousands of cows knee-deep in their own feces. They have these plugs in their flanks because they're fed on corn, and their digestive tract isn't designed for processing corn. So humans with rubber gloves come along and remove those plugs and shove their hands inside the cow's guts to manually push the food down their digestive tracts. Fun fact, because cows are fed corn instead of grass, and because we have so many cows to support our diet, cow farts are the second largest cause of ozone depletion. No, really, cow farts. At one time, the cows ate byproducts from other slaughtered cows, making them cannibals. That's what caused mad cow, a really terrible and deadly disease. Mad cow is why a lot of European countries won't import U.S. beef. Also, we hop up the cows on steroids to get them fatter, faster. No idea what impact the long-term exposure to meat with steroids has. The cows are killed by getting blasted in the face with a pneumatic hammer, then getting impaled on a meat hook to hang upside down and drown in their own blood if the hammer didn't kill them. That's after a life standing in feces while humans squeeze their intestines. What a party. You are what you eat. Mustard gas, corn rot, genetic monster, steroid, mad cow. Chickens aren't treated much better. They're held in dark feedlots, crammed in shoulder to shoulder, unable to move, often driven crazy by claustrophobia, and then they peck each other's eyes out. They get impaled and their bodies are mangled through a mechanical process, sometimes while they're still alive. If we are what we eat, then we could be mustard gas, corn rot, genetic monster, steroid, mad cow, blind, crazy, mangled chicken corpse. The American diet. So look, to the extent that you don't know this stuff, and this is the tip of the iceberg, your food is a stranger to you. You don't know what you're eating. You just stroll around a supermarket in a climate-controlled environment listening to the Muzak version of The Long and Winding Road, tossing products into a cart. Or if you're a Final Straw regular listener, you're shoving products into the inside pockets of your jacket. You're not thinking about what's in your food, the food delivered to you by the same enemies who have exploited and enslaved us for the last 8,000 years. The same enemies who gave us exploding pintos and addictive cigarette chemicals and insecticides that cause two-headed babies. We're often eating what they put in front of us and we don't even know what it is. As a general rule, if you're asking yourself how much of something you can eat or drink before it will likely kill you, you probably shouldn't shove that in your mouth. We are what we eat. Our bodies are fueled and maintained and built with the foods we ingest. And when those foods are strangers, or worse, poisons, toxins, destructive compounds, then we become strangers to ourselves. We become murderers of ourselves. Fact is, when the global slavery program maintains billions of us, it has to experiment, cut corners, and create inventive methods for keeping us fed and keeping us alive through our productive years, while finding plausibly deniable methods to shorten our lifespans, so our retirements, our non-productive years, aren't so costly. What better way to do that than by waging a silent war on our health through our food? So the question confronts us. What are we going to do about it? This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're waging a private war on the food production and delivery systems, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, 1349 Correctional Center Road, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org.
So your author page on the PM Press website lists you as War Resisters International Africa Support Network Coordinator and a bunch of other titles that I've got in front of me that I could read through.
See how many syllables you need?
That's so many. And one of the commonalities among the organizations that you're listed as working with is peace, or like an opposition to militancy. So I'm wondering if you could introduce yourself and also tell listeners a little bit about how you found yourself co-editing a book about an urban guerrilla in the U.S.
Okay, well, first we have to say an opposition to militancy, because I've never been opposed to militancy. I am in favor of militancy. And I want to say something about a leader who is actually now in certain parts of the U.S. left and progressive circles getting some more attention. I think more and more is necessary. He was an African liberation movement leader. He was a military commander. His name was Amilcar Cabral. And Amilcar Cabral was the essential center of the movement for independence and freedom of Guinea-Bissau. He was one of the great Pan-Africanists of the 60s and 70s. And he was, again, a military commander. He's probably most famous for giving the speech that contains within it the phrase, "Claim no easy victories." The idea that we can't go about using a bunch of pumped-up rhetoric and say, we had 10,000 people when we only had 100 people at the rally. So claim no easy victories. But he was also telling, and he was telling this to his troops, to his armed combatants, he was saying, when we go into a town, when we go into a community, when we go into a village, whether we do it to liberate them, whether we're doing it to defend territory, we're looking to liberate the country, we can't take a thing from them. We can't take a stitch, not a loaf of bread. We have to give back more than we take. That's what our job is as radicals, as revolutionaries. And Amilcar Cabral, in that same famous speech where he said, "Tell no lies, claim no easy victories," also said something that's not as well known, that I go around the country and go around the world quoting. He said to these armed combatants, these troops liberating their country from Portuguese colonialism, he said, we have to learn to be militants, not militarists. Militants, not militarists. So there's a big difference between being anti-military industrial complex, and being anti-militant. I've been a pro-militant all my life. We have to increase the confrontation. We have to intensify the struggles against empire, against patriarchy, against white supremacy. And what better way of doing it than by spotlighting the life, the work, the legacy of Kwasi Balagoon, Black Liberation Army, Black Panther Party, Panther 21.
Cool. Thanks for letting me jump into that in a really awkward way. I meant to say militarism, but you took it right there. Can you introduce yourself now that we've heard your hot take response?
Bruce, thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and great to be in North Carolina, and at this studio. Yes, my name is Matt Meyer. Yes, there are a lot of organizations after my name. I know this is only an hour show, so we won't talk about all of them. But, I was in part a student of Pan-Africanist Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, and he said, if there's anything you do from whatever perspective, if you're looking to make social change, you have to organize, organize, organize. So I will mention some of the organizations because the organizations are important. Yes, for the longest time, for many decades, I've been involved in the war resistance movement. I started out as a 17, 18-year-old who was called upon to register for the draft. I was one of those public registration resistors. It's useful to note that now because even at this very moment, selective service has been challenged just recently by a federal court case a few months ago that said it's actually unconstitutional to register only men. So now they're trying to figure out whether they should do away with the entire process of registration or, of course, what they would like, to register women as well. But that's a conversation going on. And, of course, those of us from the anti-militarist movement say that's a no-brainer. This whole policy has been a failure. It's both been a failure from a point of view of creating a more just society, but it's also even been a failure from their own standards of creating a policy that makes us more ready for whatever it is the U.S. wants to get ready to do. So War Resisters League in the U.S., War Resisters International, and the part of War Resisters International that I've been most part of has been this Africa support work, supporting groups like the war resistance movement in every part of the continent of Africa. I went on academically. I started when I was 18, 17, as I say, but I went on academically to become a student of contemporary African history. I'm still a student, but I also became a professor. Now I'm a retired professor. So building the Pan-African movement and supporting African movements on the ground today that are using war resistance and anti-militarist methods to make social change, revolutionary social change, is a big piece of my work. There are two main other organizations that I work closely with and define me and that are worth mentioning, and then one local project I'll just say quickly. So I am currently the national co-chair of the Fellowship of Reconciliation USA. Fellowship of Reconciliation, or FOR, is the U.S. oldest interfaith peace organization. And I'm here in Asheville doing some speaking, here in North Carolina and Georgia, doing a speaking tour that FOR is co-sponsoring along with PM Press, the publisher of Kwasi Balagoon's A Soldier's Story. And the FOR is not only the oldest group, but it's a group that has been concerned for almost 100 years. Oh, actually, I'm sorry now, it's a little bit over 100 years. WRL, War Resisters League, and FOR were founded a few years away from each other. So WRL is almost 100, and FOR is just a little over 100. I am younger than that, but by a long shot, thank you. But I am one of the elders in both of those organizations. And in addition to being slightly over 100 years old, concerned with peace issues, concerned with issues of reconciliation, it's also been at the forefront of movements for racial and economic justice. The very first freedom rides actually were in 1947, not the 50s and 60s versions that we're more familiar with, in what was called the Journey of Reconciliation. And we worked closely. Bayard Rustin was on staff of both FOR and War Resisters League at different times. So right now, the FOR is looking at a new way of understanding racial justice, economic justice, and peace. And that new way is by understanding both the institutional, the governmental, as well as the individual responsibilities for reparations. What does it mean to build a movement deeply for reparations within a society like the U.S. empire that may be dying, that may be really in some ways in death throes as an empire, but still has tremendous repairs to make, even as more harm is being done to people of African, of Latinx, of indigenous descent. And so that's the FOR, and that's one piece of my work. And then the last organization is I academically, as I said, went into teaching African studies, and it was in the context of an emerging discipline that's been around about 50 years called peace studies, peace and conflict studies. And so last December, I was elected the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. So I actually do most of my work around the world, but occasionally I get to tour around the U.S. and especially my base. So I'm a New Yorker by birth, and part of my heart is definitely here in North Carolina. But academically, I'm the senior research scholar at the Resistance Studies Initiative at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. It's not so much the University of Massachusetts Amherst, it's the fact that there's a place in this empire called the Resistance Studies Initiative. There are not many departments, in fact, only one, called the Resistance Studies Initiative, and so I'm happy to be a senior research scholar in that particular program, looking to bridge the gaps from the gown to the town, from the academy to organizing, grassroots organizing. And so we put out books like this to understand that there's a history that we need to recover, that we need to uncover as we're rebuilding people's movements.
That's awesome. That's a very complex answer. So for folks with an older edition of this book, originally published by Kwasi Balagoon, and I might be pronouncing that wrong.
You are pronouncing it correct.
I've practiced a lot.
Extraordinary.
It's
Kwasi
fun to say.
Balagoon.
What differences would they find in this third edition? Like, it's notably thicker. The prior edition solicited additional material also from readers at the end, which I thought was really clever. But can you talk about what process you all went through in building this version of Balagoon, A Soldier Story?
Yes, so there's one basic answer, and it's way, way shorter than my previous answers. What's different about this version? More.
Yeah.
It's more. You know, the soldier story, and this is true for many things that get published in this way, it was thrown together in order to have an in-print space for some of Kwasi's work. And again, for those who don't know Kwasi, and I'm sure you'll do or have done a little introduction, but, you know, this is a person who's essentially a Black Panther, revolutionary nationalist, anarchist. This is a person who is a freedom fighter, a soldier, who is also a pussycat lover of the people, playing with kids on the floor. So, you know, Kwasi in some ways is symbolic of so many of the apparent contradictions that are really part of our whole humanness that we like to pull together. And so even back in the day, after he passed, but, you know, long after, but still his memory was on in some people's minds and lives and thoughts, the idea of pulling together some of his pieces of writing, some of the things that he'd put out as pamphlets or as articles in his life, that was necessary. And then another edition came out. And when that second professional kind of book-like edition first came out, it satisfied that need. I guess it was 2 or 3 years ago, my co-editor, Carl Kwasi, one of the founders and mainstays of Kwasi Press, noticed that second edition was about to run out, that it was simply going to run out of print. He said, a few of us said, what are we going to do? Because we could just simply reprint it, or we could do something else. And the something else that we decided to do was to really go deep and get every single shred of writing, every video, audio, everything that Kwasi did that was available, and transcribe it and type it and put it into print, and also take some space for those who knew him or for those who most directly followed in his wake to write about their feelings about his life and his legacy. So, for example, this book has an incredible historical, biographical overview by the Georgia scholar Akinyele Umoja. Akinyele is, I say Georgia, but he's a great new African leader, one of the founders of the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And Akinyele's work, incredible, absolutely significant book, We Will Shoot Back, is well known. But this special piece he wrote that really brings Kwasi's relevance to the 21st century is reprinted. It was printed in an academic journal. It's reprinted as the front article in this new edition. There were a number of Kwasi's friends and extended family who had scraps of his writing. My partner, in fact, as well, visited him and knew him and had an engaged correspondence. And though we didn't reprint all of those private letters, he would often attach poems, sometimes finished, sometimes ones that had been seen before, and sometimes just on the spot. He was bursting with poetry. He spoke in poetry, from what I heard. And reading some of the letters themselves are poetic, but we extracted the things that were clearly not just personal, how I'm doing, how you doing, but poems, and printed almost all of those poems in this volume. There were special little projects that may not have been completed. We think this one was. There was a how to stay healthy in prison, an exercise book that we've reprinted in here. And yes, we've already heard from some people inside and people outside saying, oh my God, we need that exercise book now. We need this more than ever. And so we took as many. I will tell you, this is one of the problems about being the kind of editor I am, and I've edited other books with PM Press, and this is very restrained. This is PM Press and Corpus Plebedeb co-published, but some of my PM Presses are over 1,000 pages long. I'm the kind of editor that doesn't like saying no and wants more and more. And I will tell you, and I haven't said this publicly before, I've heard about one poem that we cannot find. And we just decided we can wait 10 more years
for the next edition.
And maybe or maybe not find it. If we whenever, I don't know, if we find it, we'll let everyone know. But basically, we think we've gotten almost everything that he put into writing, including a couple of pieces that clearly were unfinished. And we decided to err on the side of publishing it all. And then lastly, we collected a group of 2 or 3 of his closest comrades. There are 2 people, wonderful, extraordinary elders. Baba Sekou Odinga, former political prisoner, did 33 years in prison. And the great jazz saxophonist and also former grand jury resistor, Bilal Sunni Ali. Sekou and Bilal both each claim to have been the ones that recruited Kwasi into the New York Black Panther Party. They debate that out a little bit in these pages, and we'll let them continue to do that. But many, many other, a good dozen other people who, again, either knew him well, knew him a bit, or grew up in his legacy. I'll just name one other person, the multi-talented poet, actress, and multimedia artist, Kai Lumumba Barrow, who was based for a long time here in North Carolina and was part of the SONG, Southerners on New Ground organization. Kai is one of those who has both part of the conversation between people who knew him and her own poetic legacy interpretation of Kwasi in here. So that's the final part, is some pieces by people who said, this is why Kwasi is absolutely a person to look at in 2019, in 2020, as relevant now as he ever was.
Can you talk a little bit about Kwasi's life? Like a bit about a thumbnail sketch of his background and development?
Well, I wasn't one of those who knew him. I wasn't. And I actually have a small section I want to read that mainly quotes from Sekou Odinga, because I have gotten to know and work under the leadership of and really be privileged to be part of the current life of Sekou Odinga, who knew him when they were both youth. So I'll quote from Sekou, but I want to say something about our orientation, our vision towards Kwasi, and that question of 21st century relevance in putting together this book. We are at a time now as radicals where we clearly need, I think more clearly than ever before, militant, radical, revolutionary social change, whether violent, nonviolent, armed, unarmed. Social change and radical social change is an urgent task for the empire that is dying, known as the U.S. And the fact of the matter is, despite that understanding, many of our lives and many of our movements are in silos. We have this little group here, that group there, this campaign here, that campaign there, and never really an overarching building movement. Now, Kwasi made his decisions. he was a member of the Black Panther Party. Before that, he was a housing rights activist in Harlem. He was a member of the New York Black Panther Party. He was a member of the case of the New York Panther 21, which was the New York militants in some ways that were really pulled together by this wild and crazy FBI investigation and then New York State indictment and campaign. And then after that, he went underground and was part of the Black Liberation Army. And even after the Black Liberation Army had been targeted and in some ways had had some of its militants captured and killed, Kwasi continued doing clandestine work, underground work, until his capture in the early 1980s. And so Kwasi, despite that little thumbnail sketch, was a person who could not live in silos. He could not segregate. He had his revolutionary nationalist analysis, as did most of the Panthers, but he could not live his life segregated, one piece here, one piece there, one piece over there. So whether it was about sexuality, whether it was about black and white, whether it was about intergenerational, whether it was about violence, nonviolence, Kwasi loved people. So Kwasi's story is about being a radical, being a militant, being a, how did you say before, a member of an armed, intensely
urban guerrilla.
Urban guerrilla, that's the phrase he used. He was all those things, but he was also extraordinarily non-sectarian and loving about the people. When you talk about, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, all revolutionaries do their work because of a love of the people, that's a quote from Che Guevara, but lots of other revolutionary leaders of all stripes and nationalities, and violent and nonviolent, have that same reflection. Kwasi, from everything I've heard, everything I've read, everything we understand, personified love of the people.
Yeah, and that comes across in a lot of the reflections, as you mentioned, from a lot of the people that knew him. A lot of the things that I'm more familiar with from the second edition, but really moving sections about how, like, you would just find him in the prison yard surrounded by a bunch of people just breaking out in laughter, or, like you said, sitting on the ground playing with kids, just tumbling around like nothing.
And it's interesting, Sekou, again, another incredibly, and rightfully well-respected elder of the Black Panther and Black Liberation movement. He said, the questions of white and black, we weren't as advanced. Kwasi, somehow, it's not just about being naive. It's like understanding that there are some allies that you're going to have that connection with. The Panthers were never a cultural nationalist group. They always built alliances, even the splits within the Panthers, West, East, whatever. The entire Black Panther Party for self-defense built alliances with white groups, with Latino, Puerto Rican and Chicano groups, with Asian groups, etc. Those alliances were part and parcel of their politics, but Kwasi lived it on a very deeply personal level. So some of these issues of black and white that organizations and individuals are still struggling with now, Kwasi had in some ways transcended. But let me actually read a little bit so we get to hear Sekou's voice about Kwasi. I probably met Kwasi in the spring or early summer of 1968, and he was always a real energetic brother. You're always going to hear him telling a story or joke or enjoying one. He was always full of life, always ready to volunteer for any work that needed to be done. The more dangerous the work, the more ready he was. He was real, sincere, and dependable. That was what struck me early on. He was always ready to step up, even if you didn't need him. He would volunteer. It wasn't something where you ever had to go find him. Kwasi loved life. He clearly loved life and loved living life. He was always ready to live. He was a living dude, and most of us all really loved him. So that's Sekou Odinga talking about Kwasi, and that's in that round table of love and reflection we did. And I'm going to read one other little piece that we, the editors, wrote that summarized that reflection. And in some ways it summarizes this edition and why this edition, how this edition came about to be what it is, bringing pieces together into one whole. Unique. unique. The single word most often used to describe Kwasi Balagoon when discussing his life and legacy with those closest to and most affected by him is unique. That Kwasi's way of living and looking at life set him apart in special and wondrous ways. Even in the midst of amazing friends and colleagues, and even while living and working in extraordinary times, Kwasi stood out. Distinctions surrounding other labels and descriptions: New African Revolutionary Nationalist and Anarchist, gay, bisexual, and or queer, poet, militant, housing activist, Panther. They can be discussed and debated and reflected upon. But Kwasi's greatest quality was surely his lasting love for the people and his ability to transform that love into tangible acts of resistance.
This is the Final Straw radio show, and I'm William. You're listening to Matt Meyer talk about the life of Black Panther and anarchist Kwasi Balagoon.
You've addressed a couple of the questions already that I had written up in here. Let me get my footing again. So you've noted, the timeliness of the edition coming up, the older copies being gone, and that inspiring y'all in part to produce the new edition. Kuwasi's also kind of come up in a lot, like among other people that I've seen. For instance, the Revolutionary Abolitionist Movement has the Kuwasi Balagoon Liberation School that they've been with their program that they've been running for a couple of years now. Besides the need for being able to transcend these differences and create a movement of movements, besides like fulfilling that need, is do you see anything else, any other reasons why Kuwasi's writing would be coming to the fore and from all these different places?
It's interesting. I think the idea of looking back to move forward, the idea of looking at past strengths and weaknesses to build and rebuild. For some reason, when you were asking that question, I was thinking of my dear brother, Ashanti Alston, who is now in Rhode Island. He was in New York for a time, and he always described himself as Anarchist Panther. Now, Ashanti himself was a very, very young brother who was part of the Black Liberation Army and who did some time. But when he came out, embracing Kwasi's ideas of revolutionary nationalism and anarchism, of being an anarchist Panther, was something Ashanti both held on to, but also, I don't know, improved upon, but built upon and helped grow in the movements of the 90s and the early 21st century. And so the very specific place where Ashanti did and does that most is in a place called the National Jericho Movement. And the National Jericho Movement, as some may know, is a national, international campaign to free all remaining political prisoners and prisoners of war in the United States. And it's a horror that one of Kwasi's own co-defendants, Sundiata Acoli, a member of the Panther 21, this is also a co-defendant of Sekou Odinga, still languishes in prison after 40 years, more than 40, and after passing, birthdays that people should be, people shouldn't be in jail for their 70th and 80th birthdays. That's ridiculous. So this man, who actually was a NASA mathematician, who should have had movies about him like Forgotten Hero, whatever, this is one of the great minds of our times, who is in jail because he decided to use that mind and that body for the liberation of his people by becoming a Black Panther and a militant. So the intensification of the campaigns to free all political prisoners, like Sundiata Acoli, like Mutulu Shakur, like Imam Jamil Al-Amin, another great legacy leader from the 60s, known before as H. Rap Brown, who was the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Student National Coordinating Committee, became a Muslim. Imam Jamil Al-Amin in jail today. So we talk about the 60s or the 60s and the 70s, and we talk about reconciliation, we talk about moving forward. And in fact, we have never moved forward. These brothers have been in jail since the 70s, since the 80s. Again, more decades than mass murderers and rape, people who have committed horrific crimes against the people. These people who have fought for the people remain in jail. So I say that both because I want listeners to, if they haven't, look up the website, National Jericho Movement. Look up what that organization is doing and the list of all of the prisons. I only named a few, most of them from the Black Panther movement and organization, but not just. And we have gotten some political prisoners free. I mentioned Sekou Odinga. But the fact of the matter is they all must come out now. It's time to free them all. They are getting to an age where if we don't do it soon, we will have lost the opportunity. And these are our elders and leaders who have, many cases, the most profound and inspiring stories to tell us now, again, about those strengths and weaknesses of the past.
I'd like to mention really quickly that this last week we saw the release of Janine and Janet Africa of the MOVE organization, which is awesome. Free them all.
Indeed, free them all.
So this is an anarchist podcast, and I would like to, and other people have asked, like, how to your knowledge, and as came out in the book, how did Kwasi, did his political development come to anarchism, and how did he relate that to a revolutionary nationalism?
That's a very good question, and I think it's again one of these questions of terminology like militarism and militancy. And the question came up: to what degree did Kwasi use the word anarchism? And I think the answer to your question is best posed this way: even in his day, and even among his comrades and his colleagues, Kwasi was always a deep anti-authoritarianism. It wasn't about ideology. It wasn't about saying, hey, let's not read Marx, let's read Bakunin. It was about saying, we can't create structures that chain ourselves. We can't create hierarchies. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not a disciplined, accountable member of an organization. And all great anarchist revolutionaries know it's not about chaos, it's about organization, but it's about liberating organizations where we're accountable to one another, not to one great leader who we decide is, the king. It's always a man, so, I say the king advisedly. But the fact of the matter is that's, I think, the best way in which he embodied it in his life. He was a deep anti-authoritarian, always suspicious, always critical, always concerned about undue authority that wasn't about accountability to the collective, but was about one person or maybe a couple of people getting more power than they needed, more power than was healthy for a well-functioning collective. I think it's worth saying it's also an interesting piece of Kwasi's life and legacy in terms of this question of gay or queer. I think it's pretty clear that he never self-defined in those ways. And yet it's also clear that at some point in his life he had a lover who was male or trans femme. Again, that term wasn't used at that time, so it's hard to put words in people's mouths that weren't in play at that moment. But yes, so in this case, he's not defining as gay and queer, and yet he's living in some ways what we'd consider a queer identity for at least a piece of that time. What does that mean? Well, for Kwasi, what it meant was loving life. It meant not making those kind of distinctions as, say, you are white or you are a white anarchist, so I can't work with you. The question is, are you down with the struggle? Are you willing to do the work? And, today in 2019, we see organizations, I don't know so much about here in the Southeast, but, in New York, we have different parts of the Anarchist Black Cross Federation and former political prisoners like Daniel McGowan. We have a group of radical anti-imperialist anarchists that I don't care if you're a Marxist-Leninist, I don't care if you're a social democrat, not so many social democrats doing anti-authoritarian and political work, but nonetheless, the idea is if you're down with the idea that this empire must fall, you don't say, you're into nonviolence, so I can't work with you, or you're into armed struggle, so I can't work with you. We have to move beyond our grandfathers', I would say, false dichotomies, our grandfathers' battles. It's not about, it may have been at some moment then necessary to say, I'm with Malcolm. I'm not with Martin. I'm a Malcolmite. But this moment, 50 years later, one does not have to choose. There's an article co-written with some members of the Movement for Black Lives, myself, and a couple of other comrades, in a book of mine called White Lives Matter Most and Other Little White Lies, available through Chris Blebedeb, but also published by PM Press that co-published A Soldier Story. And the title of that chapter is Refuse to Choose, Neither Malcolm nor Martin. We're refusing to choose between our grandfathers' battles. We have to transcend those battles to another moment. Who in some ways personified that transcendence? Kwasi Balagoon.
I'm curious also, like, I see the importance of the point that you're making. I think that for me, an exciting part of this conversation is that, and about reading this edition, is that he made conscious choices that differed from so many of the people around him, and the uniqueness and what have you. And so exploring the reasons as to why he would have been drawn to, like, if you are deciding, if you've gone through the national split in the Panther organization and have chosen to, like, not side with the national leadership and have critiques of centralized authority, and you're drawn towards the writings of Malatesta or of Kropotkin or like some of the other names that are mentioned in the book, it's interesting for me. It's like not a political development that most people describe, and also the kind of thing that more doctrinaire members of a movement could like conflict around, right? So I kind of wonder, and also I brought this question from anarchist prisoner Michael Kimble, who's also gay and black in Alabama, politicized inside the system. What sort of conflicts did come, or how did that jive with his co-defendants or with his comrades inside? Did it lead to conflicts, or were people able to be like, well, you have your way of approaching things, you ask important questions, labels are aside, we're in movement together?
Wow, and thank you, Michael Kimble, and all power to you, not just for continued survival on the other side of the wall, but bringing out a profound question like that one to us here today. And that is a complicated, interesting question, and I'm already spinning with 3 different directions and actual citations to go, because also, Bruce, you spoke about the splits, and I think that's what we're talking about. But let me deal with Michael's question first as best as I can. My understanding of the history, my reading of Kwasi, is that latter piece was the most common. Kwasi, because of his commitment, because of his extraordinary work ethic, because of his love, which just was bursting out. Again, in the writings I've seen, in his writing, in his every moment, it just, was uncontainable. So that energy, I think, put him in a place where most people were not saying, oh, these ideas are too challenging, this is too crazy, this is too outside of the box. I think rather they were like, it's crazy, we're going to figure out a way of working with it. Kwasi's unique, Kwasi's amazing. But I also think, so I think that's the main answer in terms of his life. But I think it's also very important to know that our versions of the history of back then are often way oversimplified than they should be. And so as a movement historian, as a peace researcher and justice researcher, I want us to look much more carefully at the nuances of what happened back then. And now I'm going to give 3 citations about that. Another book that PM Press put out that I was involved in, and no, I'm not just doing a public service announcement to sell copies of my books, but this is one that I co-edited with a sister. She's got to be one of the greatest organizers in my tough city, New York City, within the black movement today. She's the chair of the Malcolm X Commemoration Committee, and her name is Dequi Keone Siddiqui. And Dequi and I co-edited a book called Look for Me in the Whirlwind, From the Panther 21 to 21st Century Revolutions. Now, some listeners may think, ooh, Look for Me in the Whirlwind. I think I kind of remember that was a book that the Panther 21 wrote and published, autobiographical back in the day. Yes. And that book had gone out of print, and even members of the Panther 21 who were still alive and out of jail was go on eBay and like, $400? I can't pay. I was in that book. So we took the entire book from cover to cover and republished it. But like this book, A Soldier Story, we added in we actually doubled the size of the thing. We added in another 100, 200 pages of contemporary reflections and analysis. And so that was especially done under the leadership of and with surviving members of the Panther 21, like especially Sekou Odinga, Daruba bin Wahad, who was, when he's not in West Africa, he's based here in the southeast in Georgia, Shaba Om, Jamal Joseph, and others. And the reason I bring out that book, because it talks about the Panther 21 case, is that while understanding in some deep ways about the East-West split, it also understands that some of the nature of that should be more understandable than we make it. And there are nuances we miss. And one of the simple ones, simple, complicated, internationalism. The New York Panthers and the Panther 21 were especially internationalist. They were the ones, mainly Sekou himself and others, who went to Algeria and founded and built the Black Panther Party International. And that internationalism, which now we have technology and tools that should make it easier for us to communicate across the borders. There's an anarchist concern. What are these borders anyway? Well, we have the technology to be true internationalists, but we haven't necessarily freed our minds. We haven't necessarily freed our consciousness. We haven't necessarily freed our history in order to understand the level of internationalism that they were doing back then and how we need to build upon that, understand it, and deepen it today. I'll give a second example. Even the West Coast, even the other side of the split, the leadership of Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, it should be known, and it is often not known and forgotten, put out ahead of their time a statement in favor of gay and lesbian liberation. It's not the most publicized of the Black Panther documents, but it's there. And it's there because of their own visionary struggle. So people like Kwasi Balagoon may have been visionary 10 times further out the field, but there was still more vision, more analysis, more depth, more nuance, and conversation and debate within those structures there than we have come to really believe and understand. So even as there were splits, and even as though there were harsh debates, sometimes those debates could be contained in a place where we loved one another anyway. And again, my reading for Michael and for your question is, when Kwasi was in those debates with his comrades in the New York and East Coast Panthers, there weren't primary contradictions. They were all, we're going to work together. We have our differences in personality, in character, in approach, but ultimately our eyes are on the same prize. I said 3, I'm going to name the third and last of them, and it's another PM Press book. Kwasi wasn't the only Panther who was way ahead of his time. And Sekou is not the only, and Daruba and Jamal are not the only surviving Panthers who are way ahead of their time. So I would like to name another of the still remaining Black Panther, Black Liberation Movement political prisoners who's inside, whose work is so visionary and so proficient and so profound and so necessary for anarchists especially, but also all people looking to make real deep struggle. That man's name is Russell Maroon Shoatz. Maroon, we had a successful campaign some years ago to get him out of solitary confinement. 22 plus years of torture, state-sponsored torture under solitary confinement. He's in general population, but he's still in prison. His health is not so great, and he is a visionary of little equal. His understanding of and analysis of economics and eco-socialism, of anti-authoritarianism, of looking at building maroon cultures of resistance, and why he took the name Maroon, are absolutely reading for 21st century revolutionaries. So looking at Russell Maroon Shoatz's book from PM Press is another place I'd look to for the kinds of things that Kwasi epitomized. This idea that one can have struggle within an organization, even at the moment, and certainly upon historical reflection 40 years, 50 years later, we have to have that kind of struggle to build a stronger, better, richer, deeper, more effective movement that will smash the state.
And that's Maroon the Implacable, is that right?
That is the name of the book, yes.
Well, if you know anyone, I've talked to Russell Shoatz III to try to get him on the show, and it just hasn't worked out. But if you have anyone who would ever want to come on and talk about his case and try to amplify Maroon's words and also his case and a push to actually get him out of prison, please send it my way.
I'll say this now, and I appreciate that, and we'll make it happen. And I was with Maroon's daughter, Teresa Shoatz. I was the national co-chair of the campaign to free Russell Maroon Shoatz in that year and a half when we were doing the work to get him out of solitary. And I actually just came back from Sri Lanka, where Quincy Saul, one of the co-editors of that book, along with the late Fred Ho, but Quincy is now in Sri Lanka and Fred's no longer with us. But I will tell you that in addition to absolutely pledging to help get Russell or Sharon or Teresa Shoatz on this show, I think we're going to see very soon, in the next maybe month or so, a re-intensified, a reinvigorated campaign for compassionate release around Maroon in particular. Look, it's one of the complicated things, because again, we're individualists and we're institution builders. We believe in the collective and we believe in our own hearts and minds. So yes, we build movements that are focused on individual political prisoners and their release. There was just a very strong campaign that was put forth that's building now for release of New York State prisoner Jalil Muntaqim. So I think I'm telling you now, a little preview, there's going to be a re-intensified campaign for compassionate release for Russell Maroon Shoatz. At the same time, all of these movements, from Mumia Abu-Jamal, etc., all say, free them all, free them all. And so when I say look at the National Jericho movement and its website, it is going to ultimately be about freeing them all.
So I know we've only got a few minutes left, but Michael Kimble had another question, or he had a couple of other questions. So one of them is, quote, I've read much of Kwasi's story, but never anything about organizing in prison. Was he involved in organizing his fellow prisoners?
And give me Michael's other question, because they're so profound. I want to get them all and see how many as I can cover.
The other question, what roadblocks, if any, did Kuwasi encounter from those he struggled with because of his sexuality and adherence to anarchy, and how did he deal with it? But so the part of that we didn't talk about was in terms of his sexuality.
Right. It's a very similar answer to the previous question around differences in general. I also think for a certain amount of time, as I understand it, Kwasi's relationship was when he was in prison at the very end of his life. So it was less about his comrades in the Panthers who were out and more about the people around him in prison. So in some ways that segues into the previous question about Kwasi's life in prison. And I think it's very, very good to lead into that question as one of our later questions, because it leads into another political prisoner whose name I'd like to mention and who has books written or published by PM Press, and that's David Gilbert, North American anti-imperialist white dude, David Gilbert. David's a close personal friend of mine, and of course we want David to come out as well. The last years of Kwasi's life were spent in prison in the same institution as David, and so they had not an ability to have that much depth or closeness. You know, prison still constrains you even with fellow prisoners, but there was an understanding that Kwasi's relationships, like the relationships of most people in prison, are individual, are personal, and not about judgment. So I think that's the main answer to that question about the sexuality and sexual orientation. But the more question about organizing is key. Like Maroon, Kwasi was a master organizer. I think in some ways Maroon actually has built cadre. That's what he's in solitary confinement for. He was in solitary because he kept producing within the prisons that he was many revolutionaries, or maybe not so many. He also escaped from prison twice. Kwasi was known to escape from prison. So the fact of the matter is, the essence of conversation was about organization. And though there may not have been a particular campaign, what he did in his work inside prison was to explain what revolutionary nationalism, anti-authoritarianism, black liberation was. Black liberation, black liberation. What did it mean to free the people? What did it mean to free the land? What did it mean to be a black revolutionary in the spirit of Malcolm? What did it mean to have armed self-defense and self-defense in general as a principle? What did it mean to create programs like the Free Breakfast Program? To understand that housing, that education, that food, that these are rights, and that people shouldn't have to beg from within their own country for rights. People should be able to free themselves and provide for themselves. And so that organization, that consciousness raising, that education was part of what Kwasi did probably every waking hour of the day. And that was his organizing in prison. But I also bring David Gilbert's name up, not because he just witnessed some of that and described some of that, but also because Kwasi died of AIDS. And he died in prison of AIDS. And when it became clear to the fellow inmates and to the large community of people outside who loved Kwasi that he died, and he died of AIDS, there was a certain, shock. The way there's always shock when you lose someone who's vibrant and who's alive and who's there and then not there, even if someone's ill for some time. But there's also the shock of recognition that doing something about the AIDS crisis in prison was absolutely vital. And so David began at that point, in the light of Kwasi's death and in the years after Kwasi's death, of developing in New York State what ended up being one of the first national programs of peer education within prisons around HIV/AIDS and HIV/AIDS prevention. And, we can't say how many countless lives that saved and how many people inside and outside had their own understanding of what it meant to have safer sex and what it meant to have protection, and even within the prison walls and outside of, the idea that HIV/AIDS could be contained, not because of any conspiracy theory of how it was created or who was created, but simply because of the way and by the way we relate to one another. And that peer program that David helped pioneer was absolutely part of, I would say, Kwasi's legacy. And it's an organizing legacy that affected the New York State prison system. And unfortunately, as we know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it feels like 2 steps back. But, the struggle for creating humane programs within the prisons is a difficult one at best. But we do have brothers inside like Michael, who's asking these profound questions and obviously doing his own work. And I think when and where it's possible, creating little breathing spaces, or more than that, it is still important and imperative. As much as we need to be militants and revolutionaries, no revolution in the history of the world has ever been made without many, many, many reforms. So, of course, we want to abolish prisons. We want to abolish the prison industrial complex. But on that road, reforms to make Michael's life a little bit easier is definitely something we need to do. We also want to free them all. And lastly, I'll say this. We have a little call-in that I got from Lynn Stewart's husband, Ralph Pointer, great black liberation leader and educator in his own right, and people hopefully know Lynn Stewart, the great people's lawyer who was herself a political prisoner and passed away some years ago outside. But, Ralph said, and he's right to remind us, that in addition to all of these key figures we name, be they those who have gone before, like Kwasi Balagoon, those who are inside who we need to fight for their freedom for, Sundiata Kohli, Russell Maroon Shoatz, David Gilbert, Imam Jamil Al-Amin, etc., etc., there are hundreds and hundreds of unnamed heroes and sheroes who are languishing inside, often for nonviolent offenses, often for non-offenses, for trumped-up charges. If their name was Trump, they wouldn't be inside, they'd be outside. And we have to work both to enable their survival, but mainly to free them all. Because freeing them all is in part how we free ourselves.
Cool. Well, that's a great note to end on. Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to be in this conversation with me. I really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great presentation tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to our interview with Matt Meyer about his book A Soldier's Story, out from PM Press, about the life and writings of Black Panther and anarchist Kwasi Balagoon. Check out our show notes for more info about the book and about our guest. And now here's an announcement on behalf of Matt Hinkston, who is the brother of Mustafa, who Bursts interviewed for The Final Straw a few weeks ago. Matt Hinkston, A724969, is being retaliated against for filing a PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act, grievance against a correctional officer and for having gone on hunger strikes in protest of human rights violations against himself and others in the past. One of the main officers who has been mistreating him is named Officer Lawless. They've put him in solitary confinement without a disciplinary ticket and restricted his access to communication. Although correctional officers claim that Matt has been put in solitary confinement for his protection, they're also denying him access to his property and to technology for communicating with the outside world. Incarcerated people's lives and human rights matter. Nobody should be sent to solitary for filing a PREA report against a guard. Let's call Lucasville this weekend and Monday at 740-259-5544 to 1. Ask for a wellness check on Matthew Hinkston, A number 724969, and to tell officials in the warden's area and on Matt's block that we support Matt's demands and oppose continued retaliation against him for filing a PREA grievance. Support Matt in his continued struggle against police violence, racism, and rape culture. This is a call for this weekend and Monday, the 3rd of June, which is tomorrow. Let's support this imprisoned comrade.